Hey everybody, today we're looking at Spinoza's Ethics Part 3 on the origin and nature of the emotions. And Spinoza begins this Part 3 by rehashing some of the ideas from Part 1. It starts with a preface, and in this preface, he criticizes the unsystematic way in which past philosophers had treated the emotions. And he does other places say that his predecessors weren't completely wrong about the emotions. They did have some idea about them. He does heavily criticize Descartes and thinks that Descartes has completely muddled the account. Now, it's important to know that his text on the passions, there are many descriptions of the passions, of the emotions, that are extremely close to Spinoza's descriptions. So he's not throwing out everything from his predecessors, and even his predecessors that he criticizes most vehemently, he's still taking things from them. But he says that we've failed to understand the emotions and that there is a proper method for approaching them, and he is going to make this clear and use this method. And of course, this method is considering, as he says, human actions and desires in exactly the same manner as lines, planes, and solids. And this is to say that he is going to take a geometrical approach to the emotions. And of course, the ethics is in geometrical order. So he was already doing that, and he's going to continue doing that. But many philosophers, since Spinoza's writing of the ethics, have misunderstood this. They've taken it to mean something extremely mechanical, when indeed it is deterministic and it is based on the model of determinism that we find in geometry, and in particular in the phenomenology of the intellectual act itself. When we look at the mind in its production of geometrical knowledge, and this is what Spinoza does in the Treatise on the Emendation of the Intellect, as well as in the final two propositions of Part 2, numbers 48 and 49. And basically, he shows that in geometrical knowledge, we use three distinct forms of knowledge simultaneously and in concert with each other. We use our imagination, we also use reason, but more importantly, we use an intuitive knowledge that grasps the essences. And it's this intuitive knowledge of the essence which actually has what we might call an organic form. And so between the lemata from Part 2, which describe not only the properties of movement, but the way in which movements form into self-organizing unities. Basically, the way that movements can be communicated to each other and, of course, rest, structuring a complex set of movements and rests such that they communicate their movement in a way that perpetuates the very form and shape and pattern of those movements and allows them to form a metastable whole. Hans Jonas makes this point really clear in his 1974 essay, Spinoza and the Theory of Organism, which is printed in his book, Philosophical Essays. Basically, Spinoza thinks it's part of the nature of extension, or we could just say nature. That nature has this tendency to organize, this organismic tendency within it, as something that is rationally and deterministically understandable within the attribute of extension. And this is, of course, not entirely understandable by pure mechanics, we would say, but by an autopoietic self-organization of the organism. So we must see that the emotions are organismic, that they form into organic wholes, not unlike cells and living beings. But Spinoza wants to say that the parts of a triangle and the whole of the triangle have a similar relation that we find in biology between the parts. We could think the molecular and chemical processes and the organism as a pattern of life. The striving is not reducible to a multiplicity of finite parts working together. The whole that it forms is sui generis. It is of its own kind, its own essence beyond that of the parts. And our organism is incredibly complex. It's made up of all of these subsystems, and we're dependent on all of these things in the world and our ecology. So too, our understanding and our imagination are all shaped by a multiplicity of relations to other people, the whole social sphere and history and everything we've been taught. This is not just this mass of information saved on a hard drive. Rather, it forms a organic body, we might say, and thus our ideas can be healthy or sick. And really, this has everything to do with how it organizes its ideas or its affects or its emotions or its movements with respect to either the rest of nature or the infinite intellect, which is the same thing looked at from two different angles. Now, again, we are this highly complex being, and we can be analyzed at the level of movements within the body and the body's relation with its environment and to other people. And then we can look at that level of emotions, where emotions are pushing us in different directions and combining together to create movement and inertia. And then we can look at the mind and the ideas and the interconnection and contradictions that exist within ideas. So in a way, between the parallelism of mind and body, we have this middle ground. And unlike Descartes' explanation of the communion of body and soul that Spinoza criticizes in the beginning of part 5, that he says is completely incoherent, he thinks his is coherent, and he has the right to talk about it this way because he has found what makes this middle ground a sure ground. And Descartes tries to mix two things that have nothing in common. But what Spinoza does is say that the conatus, our essence, striving, desire, these are entities in and of themselves. And while we can look at it from the attribute of thought and the attribute of extension, we can also look at it without having to go through them, without mediating our understanding, by going directly for conatus, because conatus is its own expressive potential, it's its own essence, and its free action can be considered through itself, which means we don't have to think about it in terms of either the mind or the body. We can go directly for it on its own. Now, as we'll see, he wants to move between these, and as soon as he presents the parallelism of mind and body, he begins giving evidence for a destabilization between these layers, that they actually do different things at different times. And while they are all expressions of the same reality, that is to say that the movements and the thoughts are both expressions of the conatus. But there are ways in which we don't know what a body can do, and the body can do more than we think it can, and it can astonish us as the movement and perceptivity of animals astonishes us. The body without consciousness can do things that we need to explore, and that might be our only way of doing certain things. And on the other hand, there will be ways we can use the mind considered only in itself without relation to the body that will also give us things that we can only do when we pursue mind on its own. And ultimately, our intuitive understanding of things, when we have adequate knowledge of things, will come when we understand things in terms of our conatus, because our conatus will already include both the side of the body and the mind. And again, the key here is that, like in geometry, we use the imagination and reason and intuition together. That is the goal with the emotions. So what we're going to do is see at first, basically, reason and imagination working together to map out the way that emotions move and affect us. And then in parts 4 and 5, we're going to see how intuition can be added to this and how that helps us find happiness and be more useful to each other, be more kind to each other, be more generous. Okay, so the emotions are understood as organismic determinism that is like the plane and the lines, insofar as the idea of a triangle is something more and beyond the mere points and lines, although it includes it. So reason is something more and beyond imagination, although it includes it and depends on it. So emotions build on each other and create these assemblages and organisms of sub-emotions that all fit together, and when a higher order sui generis form of an emotion emerges, it's something more than the parts, although it includes those parts and, in a way, modifies them. Our goal is to form an emotional organism, an ecosystem that is healthy and powerful. And here again, Hans Jonas' piece, Spinoza and the Theory of Organism, is really interesting on this point. He stresses the fact that our active affects, which is what we're aiming at, they are not produced by eliminating our passive affects. And Spinoza himself repeats this many times, that the more we are capable of being passive to, the more we are capable of being active. And it's actually the way in which our passivity closes itself off and we become less capable of perceiving. And what we need is not to remove all passivity, but instead to perceive more. The more we are passive to, the more we can be active. Another way to think about this is that what could be a strong perturbation into our system, like our sensory system, if we are perceiving a far greater number of stimuli, then by the sheer fact that it is outweighed by so many other stimuli, this perturbation is weaker, even though its intensity is the same. So basically, no perception is going to push us and create a great deal of inertia that we can't control, because we are being bombarded from every angle simultaneously. We are more in a stable state because of the increase in our passivity. And this points to the need for both mental and physical health. And Spinoza points this out, that the joy that affects the whole body and the whole mind, so all of the parts and the whole, he calls this cheerfulness and delight, hilaritas in Latin, which is conducive to the greatest power of our mind and of our striving, and which again intensifies our emotions rather than eliminating emotions. Now, all of our emotions can be understood in terms of the infinite implicit structure of the essence. And this is something that our imagination and our reason cannot fully comprehend. Only the intellectual intuition knows the true reality of the emotions. When we feel our emotions, we're so fixated on the object and the outcome of this emotion that we hardly look at the emotion itself. What we experience of our emotions is, in some ways, the superficial part of them, at least when we reflect on them and talk about them. What we talk about is this finite, static thing that we represent, and it is like the illusion of a stick bent in water. And what is real is something that goes beyond it and can only be understood as an essence. Now, we change the essence of the body by habituating hilaritas, this cheerfulness that envelops the physical health and the joyfulness and intellectual playfulness of being comedic and joking around, right? Hilaritas. Hilaritas is the superorganism that envelops not only the whole person, but multiple people together. It is this infectious joy of the intellect at play, which we find in comedy, and which is obviously one of the major experimental efforts in music, right? Music is this puffing up of our soul when we are filled with a sense of the glory and joy of being intellectually playful. The glory and self-satisfaction that one feels bubbling up inside themselves when they experience their own activity as intelligent and capable and expressive and loving and all of these things. And Spinoza is going to line up hilaritas with generosity and fortitude and other things like religion and piety. And we already talked about this in the Theological Political Treatise and drawing on Claire Carlyle's book, Spinoza's Religion. Religion is a virtue. It's a way of acting. It is the enjoyment of knowledge of God that leads to our desire to be in fellowship with others and to help each other. Essentially, it's the idea of agape. And piety is everything that we think and do out of our love of God, our intellectual love of God, our knowledge of God, and divine law. And divine law is basically that two people working together are more powerful than three people working alone. And the counterpart of that is what Solomon said, that ignorance is its own punishment, or the folly of living a life of wickedness is the wickedness itself, that this is its own punishment. This is what Spinoza calls the law of appetites. And it's clear that the passions are a lack of power. They represent us losing power. This is exactly what affects are. An affect is either an increase or a decrease in our power. And passions are a decrease in our power. They are also a decrease in our perfection and a decrease in our reality, a decrease in our essence. They always, though, imply a minimum of power. There's always this actually existing entity that is experiencing the passions. To suffer implies that one exists. And as we know, imagination on its own is a form of power, even if imagination is the source of our ignorance and weakness and loss of power. The material world cannot be considered as a plenum of mechanical causes battering each other blindly and inertly, but it is a world of connotative tendencies forming into macro assemblages that are autopoietic, that are self-organizing and organismic. The macro organism is the model of the micro and not the reverse. We shouldn't think about atoms and molecules making up bodies. Rather, we should think about the organismic behavior of the whole as a system. The emotion is a whole that forms out of all of the movements and perceptions and images and feelings and sub-emotions that all combine together. Emotions are what I would call enthrallments. They invigorate us and they set us on a almost fugue state where, like an enthrallment, you are sucked into a world and a kind of canalization and a tunnel in which we can only see one possibility, and we throw all our energy towards it. Our emotions come in three main types: joy, sadness, and desire. He uses these not as the base atoms to form molecules. We cannot reduce the more complex emotions to these fundamental emotions. Instead, they point to a kind of direction within emotions. Joy is the direction in which emotions go when they increase, and sadness is the one in which they go down. Now, desire is not the one which goes in the middle or something like that. Instead, desire is different than joy and sadness, but it is the conatus, the endeavoring, our very striving, as, on the one hand, conscious of some specific formation within the imagination, and which is imbued with meaning from another emotion of either joy or sadness. So we have our conatus. Because of that, we feel joy and sadness. Now we actually feel some joy and sadness, and this immediately creates desire. Now, desire seeks satisfaction. We might say that joy doesn't necessarily seek satisfaction, right? If you're feeling joy, maybe you are satisfied in that joy and you have contentment and you want to persevere in that contentment. This is exactly what Spinoza is going to say about the higher joys of blessedness, intellectual love of God, generosity, hilaritas. Spinoza defines satisfaction. In Latin, the term is acquiescentia in se ipsa. which is the affect of consciousness that is the increase in power that comes about from consciousness of one's power. So when we see our power, when we feel contentment in our essence and our power, we feel joyful from that. And there's a kind of feedback loop there between the source of the joy and the end goal of the joy, which is to increase our power, such that we increase in that very power while feeling that satisfaction. And with all these references to Hans Jonas, it's worth mentioning that satisfaction is a major term for Whitehead. And it's not difficult to see connections with this intensive notion of satisfaction that we find in Spinoza with many of the ideas from Process and Reality and this organic reading of emotions and intensity and feeling. Now, our emotions for Spinoza are not really subjective. They're not subjectivizing, or at least not always. They can be, but they're also much more than that. So the affect, of course, is more than a subjective feeling. It's the ontological change of our being. And the affect, in a way, can be pre-personal and transpersonal, can be shared among people. And many of our emotions are anticipations or expectations or memories based on our social interactions and ways of looking at ourselves as if somebody else were looking at us. Today we talk about mirror neurons and things like that, but pity, or in Latin, commiseratio, which has this sense of being miserable with someone, right? Being sad with someone. This is completely human. When we see other humans suffer, we suffer too. One time I cut my finger and my 2.5-year-old niece saw me do this and she said, "Oh no, my finger is bleeding too. I need a Band-Aid." Her finger was not cut, but she was clearly feeling some pain and distress. And it was because how sympathetic children are to the emotions of their family members. We should take this as the model for passive affects. We feel this completely passively, right? We're suddenly feeling someone else's suffering. And while it's tempting to think that this is a good source of our ethical action, what Spinoza wants to say is we should not be using our painful, sad affects and passions, and when we are completely assailed by passive affects, as our model for action. Rather, if we want to be generous, if we want to benefit other people, this should come purely from the love of God, from our sense of power through fellowship with others, through our desire to empower others. Piety and friendship are the source of our benefit of others, not our pain. And everything is organized and oriented towards the question of satisfaction. What is truly satisfying? How can everything be organized to promote the greatest satisfaction? And of course, this means increasing intensity of emotions, not diminishing it. And his answer is quite simple. What is most satisfying is knowledge of God, virtues, friendship, and hilaritas, the cheerfulness that comes from health and art and music and aesthetics. Now, our emotions work by concatenation, by being a chain, by one thing leading to another. Fear leads to anger, leads to hate, leads to suffering, as Yoda says. And the ethics is the sheet music, and we must orchestrate the symphony of our emotions to form a gradual progression of emotions, leading to ever-increasing joy through our rational capacities. And of course, the body and the mind both partake in rationality. And this isn't because the body is dominated by the mind, but because the very movements being in proportion, having ratios, this is all organismic and ends up drawing more out of itself than it contains, producing a sui generis whole with a greater intensity of pleasure and satisfaction and power to empower itself and others like it. Now, our emotions are closely linked to our imagination. What this means is that most of our emotions are initiated and structured and create these chains of concatenations because of the imagination, because the way imagination reproduces and connects images. Spinoza already made this clear in part 2 that when we experience things either one after the other or at the same time, we tend to associate them and link them together. Pavlov's dog, but there's more to it than that. If you're learning sheet music and how to sight read, there's very helpful techniques where solfege, for example, uses a word and the symbol and the tone. And by linking these multimodal expressions of different senses, we learn to sight read more quickly. And there's something called shape notes, where this was like an Appalachian technique used to make reading music easier. If you use different shapes for different notes within the scale, you can learn that shape. And this works on the principle that the more senses that we can connect in a habit, the stronger that habit becomes. This is also the case with memory. When I'm remembering later in the day talking to someone earlier that day, if I'm alone and just thinking, I'll end up mouthing the phrases and even taking the posture that I had in that moment. This increases the intensity of the memory, right? The more we involve our body in something, the more memorable it becomes. Habits get stronger by incorporating sense from a greater number of sources. And Spinoza says this many times, that when we experience an image, it's as if that thing were present. I was recently skiing, and when I was dreaming at night between the days of skiing, I would suddenly imagine that I'm sitting on the chairlift and suddenly feel terror, right? This feeling that I could fall off or that I need to be vigilant. And this would generally wake me up, right? Wake me up out of the dream because my body is responding to the need. The imagination is constantly producing the conditions under which we're feeling a certain emotion and set down a certain path where we feel one emotion after the other and react to them. Nowadays, we talk about things being triggering, and this is exactly what that means. The trigger is something that sets in motion a whole number of thoughts and emotions and images. If you think about it, the fear is this sadness, which is my projecting of an image of myself falling off the lift. And this sadness is determining my desire and producing in me this desire to flee or to escape from danger in some way or to protect myself, maybe just to lower the bar and realize that I'm sitting on a lift, because in my dream, I didn't know that until that instant and it freaked me out. One time I was waiting for my wife at the airport and I fell asleep in the car because her flight was delayed. And I woke up and suddenly realized I was sitting in the front seat of my car. I mean, I was completely safe and parked and everything, but, the emotion comes on fully and a whole chain of thoughts and emotions and images unfold rapidly. And then the idea that I'm safe and sitting in my car and everything's okay comes along, and this destroys all of those prior images. It pushes them out and it cancels them out and it removes their force and efficacy. But it only removes them to some degree, right? My heart is still racing from this dream, from thinking I'm on the lift and now I'm awake. So just by knowing that I shouldn't be afraid anymore doesn't immediately remove all of the physiological processes that accompany the emotion. We seek relief from our fear and hope, right? We are uncertain about something. We have a certain set of images that create a certain set of emotions, and that produces this desire. And all of that can be eliminated by another image that excludes something in it, and ultimately which neutralizes that desire. We find satisfaction, even if not through that desire, we find satisfaction for the source of that desire such that the desire is eliminated. So Spinoza's giving us a genetic account of the affects, how one leads to another, how They disorganize and reorganize and form into more complex and less complex wholes. It's almost as if he's giving a theogony of the affects, something like we find in Hesiod. Out of chaos came Eros and Gaia, and then we find all the offspring of each of these gods. And, from Nemusune, from memory, we get the arts and all of the muses. And from Erebus, darkness, and Nux, the night, we get doom and dreams and retribution and blame and affliction and aging. Each one of those is a god in the theogony. Well, very similar in the affects. Each of these parent affects is giving birth to many sub-affects. From desire came longing, emulation, gratitude, benevolence, as well as anger, which really comes from envy. So from envy, we get anger and cruelty and boldness. Or again, from the consciousness of our weakness, which he calls abjection, many things follow: timidity, dissipation, drunkenness, remorse, despair. But the family tree style doesn't fully work because there's crossovers between families, as we can see if we try to map these. For example, we take desire, and desire is, on the one hand, longing, if it relates to joy, or it is anger, if it relates to sadness. What I'm trying to say is that we cannot condense all of the affects and the way that they evolve and emerge in one family tree. We will need to make multiple trees, and they won't all really exist simultaneously. They'll just be certain patterns from which we follow these emotions. So we can say that a desire turns into all of these other emotions, and that envy produces all these emotions. But when we graph it one time, we're only looking at one aspect, and there will be other aspects under which these emotions are coming about. So we'll have to understand those all working in conjunction with each other. And the other problem is that we have to see that there is a concrete content always to the emotion. And it's not as if an emotion is emerging from some general category or following some path from a simpler set of emotions being added together to create another one, but rather we have these concrete situations, and that produces an emotion. We don't have to go through simpler emotions to get a complex emotion all of a sudden in a certain situation, because it's connected to the concrete content of the images and feelings involved. So desire is the desire for something as determined by another affect of joy or sadness. If we want something that we perceive to be pleasurable, then it's longing. And if it's a desire for something that we perceive to be painful, then we feel anger. Now, longings have different forms, but when there are longings for more active aspects, then we could call it emulation. We desire to be like someone, we emulate them. Now, when we desire to benefit someone else, we call this benevolence or gratitude, right? When we perceive someone to have done something good for us, we feel gratitude. Now, think about anger. It is the pain we feel when the image of something that we love or ourself is harmed or suffering. It's when we are conscious of an image of the cause of this harm. And this is nothing but the desire for them, for this thing that we are angry at, to suffer. Anger is the desire for that which we hate to suffer. Now, before continuing, let me just stress this point that I was making a second ago. There's no single way to go through the emotions. There's no one order in which to present them that is completely correct. There are multiple ways that they can be ordered. Spinoza himself orders them in two different ways. First, in the propositions of part 3, and then in the appendix, the definitions of the affects give a completely different order. The same thing happens in book 4, which also has to do with the affects in just different, more complex forms. At the beginning of the appendix, he says, I'm going to give this in a completely different order because the order that I gave it in the propositions was the one I found most powerful in proving the overall argument, not necessarily the one that is most clear to us about the affects themselves and how they relate. And arguably, what we find in the main propositional text of part 3 is that he goes through multiple starting points. He starts with desire, and then he'll start with the wavering of the mind, and he'll start with pleasure, or with pain, or with action, and with reason. And each one of these creates its own tree, and these trees have overlap between them. But they're all structured by the spectrum of joy and sadness, and the way in which more complex emotions emerge out of less complex ones. And there's always this pairing of the sad version and the joyful version. Above all, I think it's wrong to think about a general sadness out of which all of the different forms come, or a general form of hate out of which indignation and envy come. Even envy, each particular envy is unique to the image and circumstances that it arises in. And the same thing goes with abjection, right? When we feel our pain, when we feel our weakness, when we feel our inability to escape from suffering, the emotion is linked to all the complex details of our situation and is shaped and formed by them. Every unique form of dissipation, whether it's drunkenness or avarice or melancholy or depression, they don't arise from pain in general or desire in general or something like that. They arise from those circumstances, and they exhibit the general directions of joy and pain and desire. Now, when we are saddened by our weakness and this affects our desire, it can turn into timidity, because to be timid is to imagine something that is overpowering and that we fear and that we do not have the power to overcome. Now, on the other hand, when we feel a joy in our knowledge of our power, we feel devotion. This is, we desire to have that power and we desire to act. We imagine that we could increase our power, and so we feel devotion. This is a sad passion still. This is not action. It is the desire that would lead towards what devotion would be if it was fully active. Devotion is this desire. It's almost an ambition to increase our power, right? If I'm devoted to learning the piano, then I'm devoted to giving my time and attention to that work. Now, to finish up these forms of desire, we would have anger leading to revenge. Revenge is sort of, once you start thinking about all the ways you could harm someone and you start plotting to do so. Now, hatred can increase beyond revenge to cruelty and audacity. This is when, as he says, we desire to harm someone whom we love or pity. Audacity is the desire by which a person is prompted to do something dangerous that his peers are afraid to try. Audacity in the case of cruelty is surpassing all others in violence and hatred. Now, this is another problem with these type of maps, is that all these emotions in the middle actually mix joy and sadness. And while we could still think of like an overlap in the middle, and then maybe on the outside, cruelty is pure hatred and pure sadness, while gratitude, benevolence, and human kindness are pure joy and love. Hate leads to envy, and envy is oftentimes the pleasure of seeing someone suffer. And there's a certain pleasure within timidity, just as we might expect there's a certain amount of pain in devotion. And for that matter, emulation involves some pain, as does longing. Gratitude and benevolence can be purely joyful, but only if, our gratitude is received in a gracious way, or if our benevolence is effective in helping other people. Even human kindness, the emotional force behind mutual aid and care for one another, because of the nature of human life and the body and all of this, human kindness is still going to be stricken with sad emotions as well, even if the greater part of it comes from our power of will and love. Now, the order of the definitions of the affects follows from the starting point within desire, but the propositions start somewhere else, and we can graph that like this. Here we start with kanatos, and of course, moving this direction, we have greater joy, greater perfection. This direction we have less, which is sadness. And the kanatos is, on the one hand, will, when it's related to the mind, desire when related to the body and to the mind together at once with consciousness of an object and as affected by a prior state of joy or sadness. And the kanatos with respect to the body is called appetite. Now, out of joys, there are those that relate to the body and the mind at once, which he calls delight and cheerfulness. And there will be joys that relate to the body only or to the mind only, and to each in different ways. And corresponding to that, all the way on the other side of the diagram, we have the sadness that relates to the mind and the body together, which is distress and melancholy. Now, distress relates to the body as a whole in the same way that delight and cheerfulness did, which means that it relates to the whole and the parts. So what is distressing is death, the possibility of the organism becoming disintegrated. So in a way, when we concentrate the joyfulness of our kanatos, we find this delight and cheerfulness, which is in our organism. And on the other hand, when we focus in on the sadness of the mind and the body together at once with the parts and the whole, we have distress and melancholy. Now, when our desire is related to someone else and our action on that other person, we can either desire to please others or to hurt them, to retaliate, to, on the one hand, praise them, or on the other hand, blame them, which is to deem them worthy of love and benefit or to deem them worthy of hatred and violence. Now, when our joy is connected with an image or the idea of a cause, we call this love. And when our striving is undergoing sadness, decreasing in its power, and we have the idea of a cause or the image, we feel hatred. This hatred can produce in desire what we call anger, but it can also produce many other emotions, species of sadness rather than desire. Indignation is hatred for someone who has treated another person badly. Basically, it's a sadness that mixes the idea that this person does not deserve to suffer. And it's not only the opposite of approval, but it also is defined by the fact that we don't approve of the violence. In approval, we feel love and joy because of some good done to someone, and because we feel that this good is deserved. And with this, we also have a tracing of envy, because envy is when we don't approve of the pleasure that we see someone having. In envy, we hate someone and we think that they don't deserve joy and benefit, and we feel pain when they receive that, and we feel pleasure when they are denied it. So envy is the disapproval of pleasure and success of someone we hate. So the opposite of envy, in a way, might be generosity, since envy sparks desires that are opposed to generosity. Okay, now we can follow another tree of development, starting from wavering of spirit. Of course, kanatos is spirit in some sense, so the wavering of spirit is the kanatos that is inconstant, that is flittering back and forth between hatred and love and pleasure and pain. This is a trepidation, an anxious state, a vacillation of spirit, an oscillation, you could think as well. And the first two main species are hope and fear. That is whether it mixes joy predominantly or pain predominantly. So in a sense, all hope involves some fear, and all fear involves some hope. And what we are feeling more intensely, either hope or fear, is what makes it either the one or the other. Since they're both vacillations, they both involve aspects of the other. When I hope for something, I fear that it might not happen. I doubt that it could happen. I'm in wonder of whether it could happen. So from wavering of spirit is born both wonder and consternation. And wonder is more pleasurable and joyful, but it is a wavering of spirit born from us not really being able to understand what we experience and perceive. If we have no framework in which to fit some experience, we feel wonder towards it. And if we have a similar affect, a similar wavering and doubt and unknown and suspension within our thinking, but if it is predominantly painful, then it is called consternation. Consternation, we could say today, is a idée fixe. It is a mental fixation. We become riveted on the experience. Like wonder, we're kind of captivated, but it is when we are desiring somehow to escape, but instead of actually fleeing, we are frozen, looking at the thing that we fear. And in the definitions of the affects, he explains this as a wavering of spirit where we are stupefied, and stupefied means frozen, stuck. And it's the result of vacillating between two equally bad things. We're stuck between two bad things. We can't figure out which one to do. I don't know, this might be a ridiculous example, but like if you're running from a bear and you see you could go up this tree or climb out on this dangerous ledge with a cliff, and you're scared of both of these options and you just kind of waver between them. And again, here we see that this emotion emerges from a concrete circumstance rather than abstractly from simpler emotions being muddled together. Now, both hope and fear are temporal. They have to do with the future. We feel hope about some future possibility that is contingent, or we don't know whether it'll come about or not, which is the same with fear. Now, when either hope or fear lead to further evidence of the truth of the thing we hope or fear, right? That it's going to come true, that it's coming true. So if something that we hope, if we find evidence that it's coming true, we have assurance. Assurance is the emotion of joy that accompanies this evidence. And when we find evidence for something that we fear, we feel despair. And when we find out that what we hope for is achieved, we feel relief. And this shows that hope involves pain, and that when the hope is eliminated by the evidence that what we hope for is coming true, we feel relief. Likewise, when what we fear is proven true, we feel remorse, which is a negative emotion that says, I wish this could have been otherwise, and yet it is that way. In a way, it's us lamenting the irreversibility of something we wished would not happen. And it's closely related to repentance, although it is different than repentance. And repentance is perhaps what we mostly mean nowadays by remorse. Like, you feel remorse when you did something bad to someone else and you wish you didn't do it. And repentance is this kind of admission of guilt. Now, Spinoza's definition is doing something a bit more specific. He says, repentance is sadness accompanied by the idea of some deed which we believe we did by a free decision of the mind. Now, this is relating back to things he said in Proposition 2 of Part 3 in the Scholium, when he talks about sleepwalking and that we don't know yet what a body can do, with the idea being that much of the things that we see as virtues and intelligence in our life is accomplished by our body and not by our mind, and our mind is more the source of our problems with the emotions. The drunk person who later regrets the things they said and did thinks that they acted from a free decision of the mind rather than seeing that they were determined by the weakening of their mind to say things they did not will to say. It's like saying that when we do anything for food when we're starving is an expression of freedom, when in fact it's an expression of our needs being deprived. The problem is with our cognitive power and the fact that our consciousness makes us jump to conclusions based entirely on imagination and emotions. And we have this false sense of free will. So we jump to the conclusion that others are using their freedom to be wicked, when really it's being driven by sad passions. Now, we can think of sympathy as a kind of wavering of spirit, where we feel love for a person, which causes joy, and we feel sadness because of the suffering of that person. And so if the suffering is the dominant aspect of this emotion, then we call it pity, which is the suffering with someone, commiseration. And on the other hand, we have benevolence, which is when the pleasure dominates and the love dominates, and we desire to benefit or relieve them. Now, when the wavering of the spirit, when these emotions die down, when they are resolved, they tend to become either glory or shame. And glory is the joy we feel at our action, at our decisions that lead to happiness and to joy. Glory is the joy of witnessing our success and our power. We feel a joy and we have the idea that we are the cause. And so really any striving that is meeting with success can be a source of glory. I mean, we can think about when you're performing music and as you're doing it well, there's a sort of joy that accompanies that, and he calls this glory. And if you live a life of actions that are predominantly met with glory, you will have self-contentment. And the opposite of glory is shame. It is the pain at our inability to act in a way that does not produce remorse. Now, you could say that a life of glory foments into self-contentment, whereas shame and envy foment into cruelty and audacity. And this leads us to another way of graphing this out, starting with endeavoring. And we endeavor either to benefit another or to harm them. And when we endeavor to benefit, we have, on the one hand, praise, or on the other hand, blame, which results from when we do not wish to just directly benefit them, but when we wish to code them socially in a certain way. Now, when we say that somebody is worthy of praise, we're not saying that I'm going to praise them alone, but that other people ought to emulate this act of praising. That, in a way, is honoring or dishonoring someone. Along with that, we have the emotion of approval. If we are searching after having someone be honored and praised, it's because we have seen them act in a certain way, we love their action, and therefore we approve it. And this also leads to gratitude, where on the other hand, we have anger and vengeance. And of course, these can each become excessive, and when they do, vengeance becomes cruelty, and gratitude, if it becomes excessive beyond what's reasonable, loving someone more than what's reasonable, and this is what he calls adulation. Another word for this is flattery. Now, of course, if we have this towards ourselves, it's called pride. When we overestimate our own value or push it onto other people and demand praise and flattery when it's not deserved. And I want to finish by reading through the definitions of the affects. But before I do that, I want to just say a couple words about where the final handful of propositions lead in this chapter. And that is really summarized in a way by proposition 43 and a number of other propositions following it. But 43 says, hatred is augmented by reciprocal hatred, and conversely, can be eradicated by love. This summarizes the entire trajectory and purpose and underlying mechanism that guides and organizes our social affects and makes certain social affects like hatred so antisocial. And of course, envy. Envy is where hatred makes us act against our own nature. It's part of our nature to love things similar to us. And what envy does is makes us hate things that we love. He says this directly in Proposition 47. The joy arising from our imagining that something that we hate is destroyed or afflicted with some other harm does not arise without some sadness of spirit. And we've seen this with pity and compassion and a number of other emotions. There are ways in which each emotion, insofar as it's passive, still relates to sadness, but there are emotions that are actions, and these active emotions relate to joy and desire, but not to passion and sadness. And so part 4 is all about how we get out of our passive affects. How do we get out of not how we eliminate them, but how we get out of the trap that they form, the whirlpool that we get sucked into. How can we create a escape velocity? And again, following Hans Jonas, this doesn't mean that we remove all of our passivity. It actually means that we extend our passivity in a greater form in order to become more active. Okay, so I'm going to end by just reading the definitions of the affects. It doesn't hurt to hear these many times. The more times you hear them, the better we are at understanding them. Desire, cupiditas, is the very essence of a human being insofar as it is conceived as determined to act in some way as a result of any given affection of it. Joy, letitia, is the passing of a person from a lesser to a greater perfection. Sadness, tristitia, is the passing of a person from a greater to a lesser perfection. Wonder, admiratio, is the imagination of a thing on which the mind remains fixed because this special imagination has no connection with others. Disdain, contemptus, is the imagination of something that makes so small an impact on the mind that, in the presence of the thing, it is tempted to imagine things which are not in the thing itself rather than those that are. Love, amor, is joy accompanied by the idea of an external cause. Hatred, odium, is sadness accompanied by the idea of an external cause. Inclination, propensio, is joy accompanied by the idea of something that is accidentally a cause of joy. Aversion, versio, is sadness accompanied by the idea of something that is accidentally a cause of sadness. Devotion, devotio, is love of someone whom we wonder at. Derision, irisio, is the joy that arises from imagining that there is something we disdain in a thing we hate. Hope, spes, is uncertain joy arising from the idea of something in the future or the past about whose outcome we are to some extent in doubt. Fear, metus, is uncertain sadness arising from the idea of something in the future or in the past whose outcome we are to some extent in doubt. Assurance, securitas, is joy arising from the idea of something in the future or in the past about which the cause to have doubts has been taken away. Despair, desperatio, is sadness arising from the idea of something in the future or in the past about which the cause to have doubts about it has been taken away. Relief, gardium, is joy accompanied by the idea of something in the past that came to pass contrary to expectation. Remorse, conscientiae morsus, is sadness accompanied by the idea of something in the past that has come to pass contrary to expectation. Pity, commiseratio, is sadness accompanied by the idea of a bad thing happening to someone else whom we imagine to be similar to ourselves. And he adds here that compassion, misericordia, is the same as pity, other than it refers to a habit of pity rather than a single instance. Approval, favor, is love for someone who has benefited another person. Indignation, indignatio, is hatred of someone who has done harm to another person. Adulation, existimatio, is to think too well of another person out of love. Contempt, despectus, is to think too poorly of another person out of hatred. Envy, invidia, is hatred insofar as it affects a person in such a way that he is saddened by another person's happiness, but takes pleasure in the harm done to him. Compassion, misericordia, mercy, is love insofar as it affects a person in such a way that he enjoys another person's good but is saddened by harm coming to him. Self-contentment, acquiescentia in se ipso, is the joy that arises from a person's thinking about himself and his power of action. Humility, humilitas, is the sadness that arises from a person's thinking about his own lack of power or weakness. Repentance, poenitentia, is sadness accompanied by the idea of some deed which we believe we did by a free decision of the mind. Pride, superbia, is to think too well of oneself out of love of oneself. Abjection, abjectio, is to think too poorly of oneself out of sadness. Glory, gloria, is joy accompanied by the idea of some action of our own that we imagine others praise. Shame, pudor, is sadness accompanied by the idea of some action we imagine others blame. Longing, desiderium, is the desire or appetite to possess something, fostered by the memory of the thing and at the same time restrained by the memory of other things that exclude the existence of the thing that is wanted. Emulation, emulatio, is the desire for something that arises in us from our imagining that others have the same desire. Gratefulness, gratia, or gratitude, gratitudo, is a desire or impulse of love by which we endeavor to benefit someone who, with an equal emotion of love, has conferred a benefit on us. Benevolence, benevolentia, is a desire to benefit someone we pity. Anger, ira, is the desire by which we are prompted to hatred to do harm to someone we hate. Vengeance, vindicta, is the desire by which we are prompted, by responding to hatred with hatred, to do harm to someone who has done harm to us from the same emotion. Cruelty, crudelitas, or savagery, saevitia, the desire by which a person is prompted to do harm to someone whom we love or pity. Timidity, timor, is the desire to avert a greater evil which we fear by means of a lesser evil. Courage, audacity, is the desire by which a person is prompted to do something dangerous that his peers are afraid to do. Cowardice, pusillanimitas, is said of a person whose desire is restrained by fear of a danger that his peers dare to face. Consternation, consternatio, is said of someone whose desire to avoid something bad is restrained by his wonder at the bad thing that he fears. Human kindness, humanitas, or consideration, modestia, is a desire to do things that please people and not to do things that displease them. Ambition, ambitio, is immoderate desire of glory. Gluttony, luxuria, is an immoderate desire or even love of feasting. Drunkenness, ebrietas, is an immoderate desire and love of drinking. Avarice, avaritia, is an immoderate desire and love of riches. Lust, libido, is also a desire and love for sexual intercourse. And he ends with a general definition of emotions. An emotion, which is called passion of the soul, is a confused idea by which the mind affirms a greater or lesser force of the existence of its own body or of some part of it than before. And the idea, given which the mind itself is determined to think of this thing rather than that.